Today is Wednesday, August 24th, 2016, and this is the start of the interview with John Kent at St. John's Northwestern Military Academy in Delafield, Wisconsin. My name is Kyle Turba, and I am the interviewer. I am a senior at Pewaukee High School in Pewaukee, Wisconsin, and this interview is being done in connection with the Bell Tower Memorial in Pewaukee, Wisconsin. We will mainly be talking about Lieutenant Kent's service in the Army during both the Korean War and the Cold War. The time is now 6:13, and this is the start of the interview. So, Mr. Kent, when were you born?
The date,
Yes.
January 27th, 1929.
Did you have any siblings?
I have a sister.
Did any of them go into the military along with you?
No,
What were you doing before you got entered into the military?
I was finishing graduate school in Madison, University of Wisconsin.
How did you get entered into the military?
I'm sorry,
How did you get entered into the military?
well, during the time of World War II, I was the class of 46 from high school. Class of 45 was the last class that was drafted for the war. The war ended then, even though they kept up with the draft into that next year, and I thought surely I would be going into the Army after graduation from high school. I had my pre-induction physical, and of course I was 1A, so I was ready to go. And then in the spring, they dropped the draft. And so it was not necessary to go into the military. Some of my friends did for 2- and 3-year terms. I chose, because I had a small college grant, I went to college. So then 4 years later, when I graduated in 1950, I went to Madison to the MBA program. I was halfway through it, and then in June, the Korean War started. And President Truman immediately reactivated the draft. And I was pretty much at the top of the list. And knowing that was happening, I immediately, with some of my friends, decided to at least get into the Army Reserve as a possibility of doing service that way. And it worked for a while. So for a year and a half, while I had finished school and got a regular job, I was in the Army Reserve, which also gave me the opportunity to take sort of a modified officer training camp course. We had a series of correspondence courses. We had weekly drills, and we had summer camp for 2 weeks. And so after a year and a half of that, in fact, I will get to my second year, I had been advanced to being a corporal. And I then applied for my commission, and which was granted to me in December of 1952, with the proviso that I immediately request active duty, which I did. So on 5 January 53, I started my service, active duty service, and was ordered to report to the 5th Army Headquarters, which was in Chicago at the time. They immediately assigned me, since I was in the artillery, to a battery along the Chicago lakefront. Let me back up a little bit. This was during the Cold War, and of course the government had no idea what the Russians were planning to do, if anything. And so all the major cities in the country were surrounded with Army anti-aircraft batteries for protection in case the Russian bombers come overhead. So in the Midwest, they had selected Chicago and Detroit as the 2 cities that would be protected. And so I was assigned to one of the batteries in one of the battalions in Chicago. And so I was there for, just a few weeks, and they decided to send me to the radar school. They were just starting, because up until that time, the Army was still utilizing World War II technology as far as using the anti-aircraft guns, and guidance was pretty much a hit or miss situation. Bell Labs had developed a really pretty good radar system, which they then was able to employ, and so that was it brought to all these batteries to give the batteries a chance to have automatic locking onto the target from the radar to the incoming approaching bombers. And so that was a lot easier for trying to align and assess the artillery. They had 90 and 105 millimeter guns that they used. And the trouble was when you were doing it manually, you had to worry about wind direction, about currents, about direction and speed. Whereas when you had the radar, they could lock right onto the target, and then automatically with the guns would follow the target. So it was a pretty neat thing. So then of course, it's being new, they had to have all their enlisted and officers of these various batteries attend a training school to understand the techniques and the application of the new radar. So they had devised a very, very successful or a very thorough program. It was a 3-week training course, and in our case, they had it the school was in Chicago at Navy Pier. The Army had taken over Navy Pier and used that as a site for both housing of personnel and the kitchen, the KP people, and they had a ordnance group there, and also the administrative people for the school. And we had a classroom there that was utilized for the school. So I went to that school early in my active duty, and I guess I did pretty well, because later on, I was called up for about that. So I finished that and went back to the battery for a few weeks. And then I was ordered to come up to Fort Sheridan. And we were taken by train out to Nevada. They were doing some, they didn't tell us what they were doing, but it was a case of exposing soldiers to what the Army had developed was our atomic artillery shells. So it actually were shells that would be atom activated shells from the artillery guns, and to see how the poor soldiers would react to that as far as their exposure to the radiation. And so that was out for that. So that was a couple of months we were out in Nevada at the Camp Desert Rock. If you've been to Nevada, it's just one dust bowl after another. It's just dry, and dusty, and so it's a good place for that. But the Army had, or the Atomic Energy Commission had a village set up out there. They had homes, they had buses, cars, they had pens for different animals, for all these various tests, because in those days they were doing a lot of above the ground tests. They weren't worried about the radiation, I guess. Later on, of course, they were all underground. But in those days, they were all above ground. And so we were out there for those to determine exactly how effective those atomic artillery shells would be. The thinking being, the Korean War had ground to a stalemate. And of course, the Army had, and everyone had heard about the prisoners that the Koreans had, how badly they were treated. And so they were desperate to get a armistice to get their prisoners back. A little bit on the side, my wife had a very good friend whose older brother had been an Army pilot in World War II and was in the reserves and called back into service and was shot down in Korea when his friend was later released and told the family. But he just couldn't stand the food. His father had run a restaurant, and so he starved to death. And so that was just one story. I'm sure there were many like that. And so the Army and the government were desperate to get their troops back that were in North Korean hands. So they thought that this was possibly a breakthrough to break the stalemate, to have these atomic artillery shells. At that time, North Korea didn't have any atomic capabilities, and so they felt that would be helpful to them, to our government to have them. And that was in spring of 1953, and sure enough, within 6 weeks, they agreed to an armistice. Now, whether that had anything to do with it, we like to feel that we were part of it.
So you kind of mentioned that you were going to be a part of these atomic tests.
Yes.
So were you, before this, I guess, project, or before this aspect of your service began, were you kind of told what you were going to be doing and the potential dangers that it could entail?
No. They did, I will say one thing, they did cover us perfectly. I mean, we were covered head to toe with fatigues, boots, gloves, gas masks, helmets, so we were pretty well protected. And they did, as we went through, the idea was that the troops with like military maneuvers would advance through the area after the explosions had taken place. Of course, the area and the dust and this was all radioactive. And so the purpose was to see how badly it affected the average person. So we all were given, Geiger counters, took all over, and unfortunately, being in the service and being hush-hush, they never told us how badly we were exposed. It wasn't until in the late 60s or early 70s, when they finally had freedom of whatever that is, of press or something, that they let that information out as to what our actual radiation exposure was. It's a case of Redchins, and I had 2.5 or something. If you have more than 5 Redchins, it's bad. If it's over 10, it's very serious. Fortunately, we were okay, so I think most of us were under that number. A lot of we had, of course, got information from soldiers that had been exposed, for instance, those that, after the 2 bombs that fell in Japan, Army troops that went in there in those days, they didn't know, they just dug around and so forth, and those people were badly radiated, and a lot of them, got cancer and other illnesses from that exposure. So I guess they were a little bit careful after that, but we were okay, fortunately, but they didn't let us know that. So, but anyway, that was what it was. So we were out there for 3, 4, 5 weeks out there.
Could you describe one of the or what it was kind of like? So from one of the bomb droppings, could you describe like what you had to do before, what it was like to see the bomb being dropped, and then what your task was after it was dropped?
Okay. Yes, we were in sort of makeshift dugouts, kind of. And we had to make sure, and they told us with no questions at all, don't look at the radiation because it's so bright. So you got to keep your hunkered down and keep your head inside, as close as you can to your body, and wait for the explosion. And then there, of course, after the explosion, there came the aftershock, which was a tremendous wind that just blew through the whole area, really just covered the whole area. And of course, then you could look up, and sure enough, there you could see that mushroom cloud, typical thing. Interesting, there were some guns nearby that had been Army guns, and they had been painted with a regular olive drab, and they were just shiny white because the sandblast had done such a beautiful job of that very effective force. And so yeah, that's what we did. And then, of course, we were about 3/4 of a mile from ground zero, and then our purpose was then to march as troops through the ground zero, which we did. So that was it.
Okay. So what was it like the first time you saw one of those mushroom clouds?
Well, that's what it looks like. We had seen pictures, of course, from World War II, and it was very similar to that. There was a long stem, and then the big, like almost like a mushroom. It's a big stem, and then it's a big mushroom cloud, and there was intense white light from that, which you weren't supposed to see until it passed, and then of course the wind came from the explosion, and so anyway, that's what we did.
So you mentioned that the clouds, the blasts were very, very powerful, and
Yeah.
the wind and all of that. Have you ever seen anything as powerful, or do you think there's anything like on Earth right now that is as powerful as those blasts?
Well, a strong hurricane probably would be, because the hurricane is mostly the wind. We lived in Florida for a long time, and we had experienced a few hurricanes, and so yeah, that wind can be pretty damaging. Yeah, but it doesn't have the radiation effect like the atomic clouds had. So.
How many mushroom clouds did you see as a part of these tests?
Oh, I think 3.
So transitioning now to your service in general.
Okay.
Out of all the things you did, and saw, what do you consider the most important thing that you kind of did to contribute to the service?
Well, I would say this test that we had out of Nevada there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of strong leadership that you encountered while you were in the military? And if so, could you describe this story?
Well, to the extent that after I returned to Chicago to my duty base, then it wasn't long, and I was selected by the commanding officer of that radar school to come to Fort Sheridan for an interview. I was told that I had done well in that test previous to this Nevada experience, that I would be the new commanding officer of the radar school. And so that entailed being in charge of the staff. There were 4 enlisted servicemen there as instructors. And then, of course, we had classes of about 30 enlisted men and officers each 3 weeks from Chicago and Detroit area. And so it was a case of administering the school, the curriculum, the lesson plans, the duties of the instructors. In addition to the normal classroom work, we had the instructors in the afternoon, take the students out to one of the sites and get hands-on experience with the radar equipment. And the boys always liked that because they got away. But it was fine. I had good cooperation all the time from these service personnel. My instructors, of course, were very happy to be at that school because it was like an 8 to 5 job, and they weren't like doing KP and sentry duty and all those other good things that you normally would be doing. So I didn't have any discipline problems with those instructors and the students as well, because anything would go wrong, they'd be sent home, sent back to their base. So it was very, very well run, I think, and I'm sure most of them got a good deal out of it at the time for their needs.
How old were you when you became the commanding officer of the radar school?
25.
And how old were the students that you were in charge of?
Well, the students were probably just out of high school. They're draftees, so they'd be 18, 19. Of course, I felt I was old. And some of the officers, of course, were our age or older, but really listened to them.
And what were some of the duties that you had as commander of the radar school? I know you mentioned a couple, but could you describe some more of the duties that you had as the commanding officer?
Well, let's see. I had to adjust the program mostly to instruct the students at the time. Sometimes some of these students were from the South, especially at that time, had very little schooling and really needed a lot of extra help. So I had some of the instructors work with them, particularly to help them up to speed, you might say. did that. Also, I had to adjust the program now and then. I'd go up to Fort Sheridan to the library up there at the base and view and select trading films, because that was always a good thing for them to have. And so we did that. And one of the trading films, one of the instructors, hey, I know that guy, he was a fraternity brother of mine in college. There was one of those trading films. So I would do that every now and then. As I say, I didn't have any trouble with discipline. Of course, I had to make sure that...
Attention to campus, attention to barracks. Can I Kyle Harris and Johnson report
So,
the first sergeant's office?
while you were at Fort Sheridan, and while you were in Las Vegas for the atomic tests, what did you do for fun to pass the time?
Report to first sergeant's office.
Well, when we were in Las Vegas, we weren't in Las Vegas, obviously. We were 80 miles northwest, or 70 miles northwest. The troops were really they got kind of stir crazy after a while. What the Army did, which was kind of a nice thing, every night they would take a bus load, which would hold about 30 or 40 servicemen that were out there for the test, take them into Las Vegas for a night into Las Vegas. That was kind of neat. Of course, the one night that I went, they said, okay, you're going to be the duty officer, so you'll be the MP officer with your black armband and your 45 sidearm, and take the troops in. So one interesting thing on the side is the fact that the Army at that time had fairly recently been integrated. So we had black as well as white soldiers. I didn't know at the time, but as we got into Las Vegas that evening, the bus stopped at the railroad tracks in town there, and then of course they always would do. And as soon as they passed that, they stopped again. I thought, what's the matter? North Las Vegas had a casino for the blacks. Las Vegas at that time was a southern city, very rigidly segregated, so that the blacks were not allowed in downtown Las Vegas. So they were all, they accepted that. They all dutifully got off the bus and stayed at this casino in North Las Vegas. The rest of us went into town. At that time, there was no strip. It was all the downtown. There was the Golden Horseshoe and those other ones in the downtown area. So we spent several hours down there. Of course, we were all in uniform, so we got into everything free. We got free drinks, and it was a big deal. So it was a very interesting evening. We had a good time. And then, of course, we picked everybody up, and by 11 hours, we had to get them out back to the base. So we did that. And everybody came back. We didn't lose anybody one way or the other. So it was an interesting trip that time we did that. Other than that, we were confined to the base, and there wasn't much to do there.
Okay.
So,
Well, that Las Vegas adventure sounds very, very fun.
yeah.
And
Well, it turned out to be.
yeah. So while you were in either Fort Sheridan or in Nevada, did you ever write home or communicate with your family while you were in service?
Well, since I was an officer, I could live off base.
Okay.
So I was married. So my wife and I had an apartment in town. So we didn't have any children at the time, it was just the two of us. And we'd have friends that would come down to visit us. So I didn't really have a situation where I was needed that. The officers that would come to the school, as well as the enlisted men, were stationed at Navy Pier. In the evening, they could go out if they wished to. Of course, it's a long walk from the pier into downtown Chicago, but they could do that. The officers there was a BOQ for them, and then the enlisted men were in their barracks. And my instructors were kind of the supervisors of making sure everything was okay and going well. And but they were such good guys to work with. My staff was just couldn't ask for better people. So that was fun.
Are there any other areas that I have not asked you about or that you have covered regarding your service in the Army?
Well, I guess not. At the time I was assigned to this school, I said to my wife, I said, gee, it's going to be awful boring to have a 3-week class and then go and do it again. Interestingly enough, each class was different. I mean, it was enough changes of people or situations that would arise that it made it was interesting. It really was. We didn't have any other problems. We had a army group from Puerto Rico that was in the kitchen, and one time a couple of those guys got into a knife fight, and there was blood all over. That was a bad thing. So that went on. It wasn't anything I had involved with, but that was in the area there. A little fracas that went on. So those guys did that. But otherwise, no, it was pretty quiet. It was pretty calm and fair, and that went on the entire time I finished my 2 years of service, at the end of which was in January '55, and the Army had already developed these Nike missiles and had set up Nike sites to replace these batteries that we had in Chicago and Detroit. And of course, there were some here in Waukesha. They built one around Milwaukee, and there was some in Waukesha. You remember there were some sites you remember. There's one out on Main Street and 164 and one, and some of the high points on K, north of town on the way to Heartland. There's a site where it had been a site, and so they superseded the guns and the radar with the Nike missiles, because by that time they feared anything the Russians would send over would be missiles, not bombers, and so they had changed to that. And that was at the time that I was released from active duty, so I didn't get involved in that. And they had those Nike bases about 4 or 5 years, I think, until they again dropped that with the change in that in security.
So what was your last day of service in the Army? What date?
The date? 31 January 1955.
Do you remember that day?
I sure do.
What do you remember the most from it?
Getting my back pay. It was a case where when I was in the service and running that school, I told my wife and my friends, I said, I'm not going to take any leave, because if they get somebody else in here, then what happens when I come back? Mm-hmm. So I just kept at it. I did get a Christmas break that first year, but other than that, I just went right straight through. So I had quite a bit of accumulated leave time that I was able to pick up several $1,000s, which in those days was a lot of money. So that was good.
What were some of the life lessons that you learned from being in the military?
Well, in my case, it was being prepared. I always had to make sure I knew what was coming off, and didn't want any surprises, if possible, from my end anyway. Always had being prepared for what I was about to do, and so I wouldn't be caught flat-footed, and well, made sure that all my people were well taken care of, and any complaints that I could hear about, so we could take care of, so that things didn't get out of hand. And so that I was very open with that, with these men that I had to work with. Well, that was good.
Was it tough to readjust back to life when you got home after serving in the military for a couple of years?
Somewhat, yes, it was.
What were some of the challenges?
Well, you didn't have a routine that you were in, where at least you kind of controlled your own destiny, and sometimes you didn't quite know how to handle that. But yeah, that was the difference. In the Army, of course, everything was a routine. You knew exactly what was happening every day, and you had to take care of the things at hand. When you were out of the service, you had to make sure, well, you had to do everything again on your own, you might say.
So what career did you pursue when you left the military?
I went back into, I was in marketing and sales, so I went back into sales.
How long were you in sales?
35, 40 years.
So as future conflicts came up, as time went on, did you ever consider serving in those fights?
No,
No.
no, I did not. Because I had a family by that time, and I just didn't feel that I wanted to expose them to that. One thing about being in the service, I mean, career people are fine, but you're not your own person. I mean, you go where they want you to go, and you don't quite have control of your life. So.
You mentioned this earlier, but you eventually found out how much radiation you were exposed to from the atomic tests. Could you restate how much radiation you were exposed to and the scaling of what was deemed okay, like somewhat okay or very dangerous?
I had 2.4 to 2.5 Roentgens. Under 5 is okay. More than 5, it's a chance that you might get, cancer or some of these diseases. And so we're under that number, so it was okay. Fortunately, I never had any experience like that.
Do you remember when you finally found out that information, how many years after you participated in the tests?
1968 or 69. So that would be, we'll do the math, about 20 years, 15 years.
Were you wanting that information sooner? Were you mad that the government was not releasing that
A
information?
little bit unhappy. I mean, of course, I felt okay, and test I went through with the various doctors I went to, there was no indication of problems, so I guess I felt pretty comfortable about that. And of course, it was nice to hear that when they finally released all that information to everybody.
Did you know anyone who had those higher levels of radiation who could be?
No, I can't say that I do. No.
So transitioning to later in your life, have you gotten a chance to visit the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C.?
Yes.
Did you go on an honor flight? Or
Yes,
you go
I
on...
did. An honor flight. Yeah.
Who went with you on the honor flight?
My son.
Your son? What was that experience like, to show him the memorial from the war?
It was really interesting. He really enjoyed that. It's one of these things you talk about, you don't really talk about. And so when you see that, it makes a big difference. Yeah.
As a veteran of the war, what was it like for you personally to see the memorial in person?
Well, it was interesting to see it. Of course, not having exposed to the actual combat, I couldn't relate to it from that angle, but just the idea of seeing what those guys went through, some of them really suffered. They really did. So they deserve any credit they can get.
So what advice do you have for soldiers today who are either serving in the military right now or who are in the process of training?
What advice?
What advice, yeah.
Well, do your job. Always look for opportunities to advance yourself in school or classes or anything that would advance your career, and take advantage of any choices that if they offer you, be sure you take.
Last question, Mr. Kent. How do you want veterans of the Korean War to be remembered?
Well, I suppose like any war, in time that fades away in the past and you kind of forget. In fact, the Korean War was often called the Forgotten War. So the memorial helped. It's a memorial I don't think I would do if I were doing a memorial. I like the World War II memorial a lot better, but it's very realistic in the sense that it's a series of soldiers on patrol in their combat uniforms, slogging through this terrain. It's a little brusque, a little, stark. They do have a wall behind the memorial, sort of like the Vietnam Memorial, where the names are engraved in this wall, and that's kind of nice. But at least there's something there, though. That's good.
I would like to thank Lieutenant Kent for taking part in this project for the Bell Tower Memorial, and I'd also like to thank him for his service to our country. This is the end of the interview on August 24th, 2016 with John Kent. The time is now 6:47 p.m.
Okay. Well, thank you. Hope I did all right.
I think you did good.
Okay.